Wonderful. Thank you very, very much for sharing these results. And it sounds like an absolutely incredible sort of piece of work, and was also very useful to get the backdrop before you got into the actual study. I think it was very useful for this audience. So the floor is open to for questions. We have about 20 minutes or so. We'll take 3 or 4 questions together and then hand back to you. So my colleague Partho. Just step up if you could.
Thank you. 2 quick things at the end. I was just going to try and figure out. One sort of related. The LPG story that you spoke about. One of the things we see, at least in the north, is a household may have access to LPG, but it's not used for the bulk of the cooking. So it's your bulk of the cooking is still biomass, especially your morning, lunch, dinner kind of stuff. And LPG is a quick start, intermediate kind of story, and that sort of helps them manage the expenditures at one level. And the second is, again, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this, because one of our colleagues working on, especially as you said, the cash transfers kind of story, things like institutional deliveries. And that what we find, I think, what additional finds is institutional deliveries have indeed risen a lot, but you do not get the expected outcome in terms of maternity. That hasn't sort of moved as much as you'd expect if you moved from home delivery to institutional delivery. And therefore, the question is whether either there are complicating factors sort of moving through, or are we, in some sense, targeting the wrong instrument in some sense and going forward. So I thought we'd get your reactions to kind of stuff in terms of trying to see where we can take this to policy and structures going forward.
Just one over there and then over there.
Hello. Hey, Rob Sampson, ID Insight. Question for you. You mentioned early on sort of past studies have had trouble getting traction with policymakers because of sort of the validity to the context. Obviously, this has sort of good internal validity within the context. Have you had this conversation with policymakers about this specific research, and sort of what's the response been? Has it changed? And how do you foresee that sort of impacting the conversation? I know you mentioned specific opportunities about sort of the charismatic nature of moving the conversation to sort of birth weight, but just in general about sort of pollution and its effects. How has that gone?
One last question, and then we'll turn back.
I'm Suresh Mohammed from the World Bank. I just wanted to know about any confounding factors. How did you adjust for that? Because this was, I don't know whether you had a control. Various confounding factors which can lead to a similar reduction in the birth weight. So that's one thing. The second interesting thing is about integrated exposure response function curve, very interesting curve. Above 180 microgram, it looks like the heart disease risk is. So I think all of us in Delhi are now in that above 180 micrograms. So, is that a sort of a, in the sense, it's an absolute thing, or, is it something which I think everybody in the North India should be now, every policymaker should now have that graph should be shown to everybody. I think if that's proved through evidence, then it's an important curve you've shown.
Could I have just one quick addition, which is the other thing that intrigued me was the relationship between stunting and exposure, because we do a whole bunch of stuff here on sanitation, and the thing was the debates moved from like malnutrition to sanitation, and are you now saying that it's also significant effects of air pollution might be on stunting? I'm just looking at what is the number of multiplicative factors that actually might explain childhood stunting.
Indeed. Okay, so I'll try my best to remember this question sequence, and please help me out if I miss answering. So the first question, indeed, we completely recognize access does not translate to use, unless it is accompanied by, other kinds of economic, subsidies or other kinds of economic support. And clearly, everything that the PMUY and all the other current expansion programs are only, starting to address the first barrier, which is sort of, getting a legitimate, access, potential access, so to say. But the economics of it prevents, continues to prevent 80% of the people who are currently relying on biomass to be actual exclusive users of clean fuels. And therefore, your point is very much along the lines most policymakers often even ask, other than MOPNG, saying that is, solid fuel use really, is that still a problem? Aren't we all using LPG most of the time? And this is not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. For most rural masses, using biomass most of the time, they might have an LPG connection in their house, but they are not going to be exclusive users of LPG for a very, very long time. So if there are health effects, and if there are health effects on pregnant women, so one of the things we are now in discussion with MOPNG is to sort of say, can we look at an Ujjwala Mamta, where we can sort of really look at poor pregnant women dependent on biomass, not having an LPG connection, could potentially be provided with LPG for the duration of the pregnancy. Not, clearly even the ministry can't come up with money to provide free LPG for a lifetime, but if there is an impact on birth weight, could we sort of, piggyback this on? And it's not only the birth weight benefits of LPG, it's quality of life benefits of LPG, it is energy, security aspects of LPG that might actually benefit the pregnant women in many other ways, not just the actual air pollution effect on birth weight. But if air pollution is indeed a major, and in our case it is, we are expecting a significant shift in the birth weight. So we are hoping to transition at least one of the vulnerable segments to less dependence on biomass by influencing policy, so that we can at least try and see if the poor pregnant women, there can be a case made to that. But not just pregnant women. In general, the ministry needs to sort of find ways to address household air pollution related impacts, to move more people from just providing access to more sustained use. If it is a different economic breakpoint, if it is a different price policy on LPG, and if health would be an argument to sort of really increase the pitch on that, that would be one thing. The second thing you asked in terms of institutional deliveries not translating to maternal health indicator improvement. Yes, indeed, there are many reasons that can explain this, and while institutional deliveries have certainly brought down rates of neonatal mortality, morbidity, the maternal health outcome has not exactly been addressed sufficiently. And perhaps household air pollution can be one of the explaining reasons, but clearly not the only one. There are whole issues related to maternal nutrition. Maternal nutrition continues to be a huge, huge challenge, and so this also relates to your question on how we address confounders. So we had to actually reconstruct the maternal nutritional intake through food frequency questionnaires, through some very elaborate, assessments, and also sort of really measure maternal BMI and maternal weight gain. So in a cohort study, you actually don't need a control. What you have is a gradient of exposures and outcomes, and you collect information on all the confounders that are likely to affect either the exposure or the outcome, and when you adjust for it, and you adjust for it in the model. So you don't have an unexposed or an exposed population, you have a continuous range of exposures. But the institutional deliveries not improving on account of or the maternal health not improving only on account of institutional deliveries has many parts to it. Your question on, can we influence policymakers? Well, gee, I wish it was easy with just one study. I would be, it's not this, and in general, even if our study is very persuasive in terms of adding new evidence locally, I think it would be a complete mistake to sort of just rely on one study. And even when we are saying we need India evidence, India should be adding evidence to the global pool of evidence, and it has to circulate back by having enough European evidence in there, enough American evidence, enough South Asian evidence, enough Indian evidence, enough Chinese evidence. I don't think this 4-gram estimate can be used as some kind of a golden truth of doing that. It really has to be substantiated. But to the extent that we are contributing to increasing the pool of India studies and exposure response studies, to the global pool, hopefully our dialogue with policymakers will get better. There was a policy brief associated with this particular study that ICMR has circulated, but I don't really expect any major shifts just because of the publication of this study. I do expect it to contribute to the growing pool of this discourse, and I think. Did I answer all the questions? And the graph, okay. The IERs, yeah. So the IERs, there are limitations of the IERs in the sense that we don't know the absolute shape of the exposure response curve. Actually, this is the latest version of of the exposure response curve for ischemic heart disease, lung diseases, including cancer and chronic obstructive lung disease, cardiovascular stroke, and lower respiratory disease. And you can see, ischemic heart disease plateaus, the soonest compared to lung cancer, for example, that remains mostly linear, and also lower respiratory disease. That's not showing too much signs of plateauing. So there's still some ambiguity on the shape of the exposure response curve because we don't have studies in every part of the PM2.5 exposure spectrum. We have from the developed country studies and we have from the smoking literature. So it is a form curve that is anchored by the smoking literature on the upper side and the ambient air pollution literature on the lower side. In between is getting slowly populated, and it seems to be more or less consistent. We haven't seen any evidence, and this was really to sort of make a way forward for policy level actions. To sort of, otherwise India or China for that matter would not be even able to estimate the burden, right? There is no epidemiology. So either we could have just taken the outdoor ambient air pollution exposure response studies. But is it the same as household air pollution? We don't know. But then, is it the same as smoking? So if you go with the assumption based on mechanistic evidence that there is currently no evidence in terms of toxicology of PM2.5 from the various sources, whether you expose a cell line from diesel exhaust or biomass smoke, or for that matter, smoke, tobacco smoke for that matter. The PM2.5 characteristics don't seem to matter too much, but that is still limited mechanistic evidence. How it plays out in epidemiology is not known. So despite the uncertainties, and so this is what policymakers are not wanting to buy. There are not enough Indian studies in the integrated exposure response function, and two is that you are trying to mix all the sources together, and that's not valid enough. The arguments that we want to put forth against is all the short-term studies that have been conducted in India seem to be in line with the short-term studies conducted elsewhere in the world. So we don't have the long-term studies, but there is nothing to expect that the long-term studies would be any different from what has been reported elsewhere in the world. The second is, there is no difference in the lab studies that seem to be sort of indicating a difference. So the integrated exposure response is the best we've got at this point. And if public health precautionary principles are to prevail, then we would at least want to know. We don't know what the benefit from going from 400 to 100 is, right? Because we are at the flat part of the curve. But we all know that even if we were to be conforming to Indian National Ambient Air Quality Standards of 40 micrograms, we are in the favorable part of the spectrum already. So even if you don't want to go from, so our point is to sort of really go at least from really bad to the Indian national standard. What kind of source control, what kind of emission control strategies would get you to the Indian national standard? And there the benefit, is pretty clear. IERs or no IERs. You don't have to have the IERs. In fact, way back when we formulated the WHO interim air quality guidelines, which I was the chair of the task force that was responsible for the interim air quality guidelines of 35 micrograms. At that time, there were no IERs. We just relied on the EPI and the ambient air pollution epidemiology and the smoking literature and that not even smoking literature. It was just pure ambient air pollution epidemiology, and that seemed to indicate that getting down, not being much about 35 was going to be really important. And so that's how the National Ambient Air Quality Standards came up to be close to the WHO interim target air quality guideline of 35 micrograms per meter cube. So all I'm trying to say is, even if you approached it independently, there is really not much that is pointing out to the fact that that the burden estimates would be much lower than what the IERs is predicting. The IERs, in fact, would be making a pretty conservative estimate of the burden using this approach, because you're really anchoring it. And if it indeed it was linear, didn't flatten out so quickly, your burden would be only that much higher. Yeah.
Just take another round of questions. I have one as well, but we'll have to be very quick because we're running out of time. So very brief questions, please. Somebody take this way around the room.
Thank you. Rifat Hassan, I'm here from the World Bank, and I'll keep it brief, but I have two brief questions. So one is around the policy realm. So given your results, from your perspective, what is the key policy implication coming out of it? Because I think there are two umbrellas of them. One is the implication that it's important to reduce air pollution given the effects, in which case policy implications would be primarily outside of the health sector in terms of what do we do to improve air quality. The other set of policy implications could be that given these health impacts, the health sector needs to respond. If that's the case, how does it do that? So you mentioned CCTs, but how would you actually structure it? What conditions would be linked to payments to change what behaviors? So that's one question. The other sort of technical estimation question is, you have estimates on low birth weight prevalence as well as what is the absolute amount of difference in birth weight. Can you take these numbers and take it to the next level in terms of extrapolating to make estimates on cognitive development, on human capital accumulation, labor productivity? Because there's other literature that will link your birth weight stunting data to then wage increases as an adult. So trying to extrapolate in that way to not only make the argument in terms of, yes, this has implications on health outcome, but it has implications in terms of economic growth for your country. So in terms of trying to reach policymakers, which policymakers at what level, and can we use this combined with other data to make a sort of a broader kind of an argument?
I'm asking this question as an environmental chemist. The substances the chemicals that you listed out in one of the earlier slides, I'm wondering if there are studies in the literature or that you're aware of that connect those with actual DNA mutations, at the actual cellular level, if you're aware of any of these. The other one, the second question is, if I'm not mistaken, you had a season of conception as one of the parameters.
Right.
Would you be able to tell why you took that?
The idea is, okay, go ahead. Anyway,
because there's a question attached to that.
Okay.
So, I don't know how to do this.
Okay.
Yeah, just put in one question of my
Sure.
own, and then question, and it really comes back to the issue of communicating to policymakers. This sort of number that is sort of a headline number, 4 grams of birth weight loss per 10 micrograms, as a policymaker, when you see these kinds of curves, then you sort of immediately ask the question, well, which part of the curve is this true for? Because obviously not true for the whole curve, because it's not linear, right? So is there, and that's, so it's hard to grasp. I've seen other studies that talk about X% increase or X% increase in the probability of a certain effect, which is even harder to grasp because you don't know what the baseline level of probability is. So you know, I'm sort of wonder as an outsider for the profession in terms of communicating to policymakers. These two things seem to be confounding factors, in addition to all the points you mentioned about India data and so on and so forth.
Let me start with the last question. So we did the dose response, and it seems to be linear in the range of 20 to 190. So there is no evidence for non-linearity. 190 was, you know, pretty much our 95% upper bound. So it seems to be pretty, and that's Tamil Nadu, you know, 20 to 190 rural urban. I would imagine that's, you know, that's pretty much quite a bit of India, except for you know, some of Bihar, Haryana, and you know, quite a few of the cities are probably in that range of 20 to 190. You know, except during you know, winter seasons, but the long-term annual average is probably around that range. And since you know, so therefore, I think we need to be sort of really looking at dose response beyond 190, and to the extent that 20 to 190 is much better than, say, for example, you know, 0 to 30, where the developed country ambient air pollution studies have been done thus far. Nobody is, you know, very few people are under 30 in India anyway. So at least, you know, we have an exposure range that is representative of exposures experienced by a very large proportion of the Indian population. So in relation to the season of conception, you know, the season of conception is to sort of really look at, you know, temporal changes in exposures. So for example, if there was a trimester specific effect, for example, if you conceived in December and then, you know, or conceived in June, you know, so we didn't have sufficient number of measurements because they were essentially household direct measurements. In ambient air pollution studies, for example, where they have continuous daily data throughout their pregnancy. So for the entire duration of the pregnancy, they would have daily data, but they are essentially nearest monitor available data, for example. They have found that first trimester and last trimester exposures are more critical than second trimester. So you would have to adjust for the season of conception. I know if there is you know, if there is a differential effect, you know, based on the air pollution concentrations expected, and whether you are in your first trimester as well or in your last trimester in winter. The second question relating to chemistry is that, you know, yes, indeed, you know, if there is evidence that you know, particular you know, PM2.5 is just an surrogate indicator for a whole complex mixture. And so polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are thought to be the biggest culprit, you know, mainly because of their ability to, you know, especially in relation to all kinds of carcinogenic outcomes, because it is a class 1 carcinogen as it is classified. So for birth weight, we quite don't know what the relevant toxic moiety is on PM2.5, but for different outcomes, there is a linkage to specific speciation, specific information on PM2.5 is available for each one of these outcomes. But in general, you know, we know that Mars-based PM2.5s are best possible proxy for the entire constituent mixture. Coming back to this, you know, this whole technical question on being able to extrapolate it, I mean, the policy relevant question on extrapolating it out to cognition and out to economic impacts. You know, my own experience is, a few important empirical measurement studies can have a bigger influence on policymakers than very fancy models and projections with a lot of uncertainties. This has been just my personal experience because you fluster them. The numbers look big, they look unmanageable, then they don't understand the assumptions, and they start questioning you, and you become. But a few direct, empirical studies done all across India, basic level, uh, I feel, can influence some of these policymakers, in a much more substantive ways, because, there is not enough capacities to sort of really absorb all of this modeling and all of this, at the ministerial level. We are just a handful of environmental epidemiologists working in the country, so you can imagine, any of these quarters. And the last thing we want to do is to sort of put them in a spot by, having more assumptions. So I would still hesitate a little bit to sort of really carry this out, especially for birth weight and cognition, because the evidence is not there yet. But certainly, if we can convince them on the IERs and all of this is much farther along, than the birth weight and the cognition. But I agree, birth weight and cognition may be the game changer. So strengthening this evidence, relying on some good meta-analysis, not just this 4-gram decrease, but to sort of really look at what is the evidence. There is independent evidence on cognition, independent of birth weight, and then air pollution, birth weight, and then cognition. But to add the India study to that pool to sort of really then calculate it out would be much more powerful. And the final question, I forgot your first part of the question. The technical question was. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. We have, all actions on air pollution are outside of the health sector. So how to facilitate this intersectoral dialogue where health ministry would anchor? Because all actions on air quality are, either the petroleum ministry, the transport ministry, or, some other ministry. But it's not, it's not health. But if health is the driver, then, health ministry really needs, and we did have a steering committee on air pollution, of which I was a member, and there have been recommendations made for implementation. So the actions are, the key message are that actions are definitely needed, but these actions are outside of the health sector. So health ministry really needs to use this evidence for and request actions from the other concerned ministries. If it's the MOPNG on LPG, if it is, coal or other parts, for other contributors to air pollution. But it's really, the health ministry needs to process this, to accept this evidence and bargain for investments by other ministries, because these actions are outside of the health sector.
Great. Thank you very, very much. I think we're out of time, but it's been a fabulous and fascinating discussion. So really very, very grateful to you for spending the time with us, and look forward to keeping up with your research. Thank you.
Thank you.